Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture we're going to talk about EC2 placement groups. So congratulations, you're almost at the end of the EC2 section of the course. You've done really well. Hopefully you've learned an awful lot and had an awful lot of fun. In this one it's just a pure theoretical lecture. EC2 placement groups do come up on the exam. There used to be only one type of placement group, and it used to be a very popular exam topic. Now there's 3 different types of placement groups and you will need to understand what they are going into your exam and the differences between the 3. So what is a placement group or an EC2 placement group? Well, it's pretty obvious from the name actually. It's just a way of placing your EC2 instances, and there's 3 different types of placement groups. So we have our clustered placement groups, our spread placement groups, and then our partitioned placement groups. And we'll go through each one individually. We'll start off with the easiest. So clustered placement groups is basically a grouping of instances within a single availability zone. Placement groups are recommended for applications that need low network latency, high network throughput, or both. So essentially, it's a way of putting your EC2 instances very close to each other so that you have very low network latency and you can also have very high network throughput. So that's all it is. It's a way of grouping your EC2 instances very close together within a single availability zone. And only certain instances can be launched into a clustered placement group. We then have our spread placement group, and this is basically the opposite idea. So it's a group of instances that are each placed on distinct underlying hardware. So these will be on separate racks with separate network inputs as well as separate power requirements. So if you have one rack that fails, it's only going to affect that one EC2 instance. So spread placement groups are recommended for applications that have small number of critical instances that should be kept separate from each other. And you can have spread placement groups inside different availability zones within one region. And with a spread placement group, I want you to think of individual instances. So this individual EC2 instance is on this individual piece of hardware, and it's completely isolated from this individual EC2 instance and this one, etc. So if a rack does go through and fail, it's only going to affect the one instance. So that's all a spread placement group is. It's the sort of opposite of a clustered placement group in that, clustered placement group puts all your EC2 instances very close together, so you get really high performing network throughput as well as low latency, whereas spread placement groups are designed to protect your EC2 instances from hardware failure, but it's individual instances put on individual racks inside either the same availability zone or different availability zones depending on how you configure it. We then have partition placement groups, which are very similar to spread placement groups, except you can have multiple EC2 instances within a partition. So when using partition placement groups, Amazon EC2 divides each group into logical segments called partitions. And Amazon EC2 ensures that each partition within a placement group is on its own set of racks, and each rack has its own network and power source, and no 2 partitions within the placement group share the same racks, allowing you to isolate the impact of hardware failure within your application. So if you go through and read the documentation, it does take a little while to get your head around the difference between a spread placement group and a partition placement group. And basically the difference is you can have multiple instances in a partitioned placement group. So you can have multiple instances on this rack, and you can have multiple instances on this rack, and this rack is completely separate to this rack. So EC2 instances are basically sitting on partition 1, and then you've got a whole bunch of EC2 instances sitting on partition 2. That's a partitioned placement group. But if you're dealing with individual EC2 instances, then that's a spread placement group. So a spread placement group is for a single instance, partition placement groups are for multiple instances, and then your clustered placement groups are just a way of putting everything as close together as possible. So on to my exam tips. Just remember the 3 different types of placement groups. So we've got our clustered placement groups, our spread placement groups, and our partition placement groups. So what is the use case for a clustered placement group? Well, it's for low network latency and high network throughput. So you want your EC2 instances to be as close to each other as possible. They'll always be in the same availability zone in the same region. Our spread placement group is where we've got individual critical EC2 instances, and we need them to be on separate pieces of hardware. So if one piece of hardware fails, it's going to isolate that EC2 instance. It's not going to knock out two EC2 instances at once. It's only going to be that one EC2 instance. So that's all a spread placement group is. And then partitioned is for multiple EC2 instances. So use cases for this could be HDFS, HBase, and Cassandra clusters. So partitioned is basically just multiple EC2 instances, whereas spread is individual critical EC2 instances. A clustered placement group can't span multiple availability zones, whereas a spread placement and partitioned placement group can, but they still have to be within the same region. The name that you specify for a placement group must be unique within your AWS account. Only certain types of instances can be launched in placement groups. So these are things like compute optimized, GPU, memory optimized, and storage optimized as well. AWS recommend homogeneous instances within clustered placement groups. So if you are doing a clustered placement group, you want to have the same EC2 instance types inside that clustered placement group, or at least that's Amazon's recommendation. You can't merge placement groups, and you can't move an existing instance into a placement group. What you can do is create an AMI from your existing instance and then launch that instance from the AMI into a placement group. So that is it for this lecture, everyone. If you have any questions, please let me know. Congratulations for getting it to the very end of the EC2 section of the course. In the next lecture, we're just going to summarize everything that we've learned in this section of the course, and then we'll be able to move on to the next section. So if you've got the time, please join me in the next lecture. Thank you.